Thanks, and what a great audience to talk about one of my favorite topics in terms of human rights issues in the Middle East, the issue of migrant workers. There are so many important issues related to business and human rights in the Middle East, from the sale of arms and sophisticated monitoring equipment to oppressive governments who have deployed them against their own populations, to environmentally unsound practices of international companies that operate with minimal regulation. But the issue where businesses in the Middle East have the largest direct hand in human rights abuses is the employment of migrant workers, who make up the overwhelming population of the workforce in many countries in the Middle East, particularly the Gulf. As you'll see from the chart behind me, in some countries, the migrant worker pool is 90 or 95% of the entire workforce. We have researched migrant worker conditions in Jordan, Lebanon, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Qatar. I want to focus on this population of migrant workers and the system and businesses that deprive them of their rights, not just because it's an important issue to identify and expose, but because it's a problem with ready, accessible remedies, unlike so many of the problems of the Middle East, and where we have opportunities to target reforms not only by governments, but by the businesses who employ workers. Who are the migrant workers? The population of migrant workers in the Gulf, Lebanon, and Jordan, approximately 15 million people, make up a significant population in the region. And as I mentioned, a significant population of the workforce. They occupy every niche of jobs in the country, even high-level government positions. Oftentimes, the person right below the minister is himself a migrant worker. And the vast majority, however, occupy low-paid, unskilled jobs. Construction workers employed by businesses, employed by multinational companies, are in fact the largest percentage of foreign workers, migrant workers, in the region. But what's the problem? Just some pictures. The triangle of oppression, as I like to call it, is rooted in the interplay of three factors. And I think it's important to understand the system that migrant workers are employed in to understand why the abuses are so prevalent in the region. The so-called Kafala, or sponsorship system, which puts all power in the hands of their employers. The payment of steep recruiting fees by workers, and the confiscation of their passports, which together create circumstances of what we've concluded is forced labor. The Kafala system, which exists in every single, sorry, my little arrow thing here, in every single labor importing country in the region, except Bahrain, which recently abolished it, basically grants the employer the status of sponsor, which allows him to obtain a visa and work permit for the worker for the duration of his contract. Workers are barred from changing jobs to a different employer without the explicit consent of their employer. So even if an employer doesn't pay wages or otherwise abuses a worker is not free to quit and find another employer without judicial approval, which we've documented is virtually never granted. A worker who quits or flees, as it's called, his job, is subject to immediate deportation. His visa is canceled and he can be arrested and deported. In this sense, a worker is very much tied to his employer. In a number of countries, a worker also has to obtain an exit visa with his employer's consent before he's even allowed to leave the country. For added protection, there is the near universal practice for employers to confiscate the passports of their workers as insurance against a worker running away or finding another employer. Of course, it's illegal under international law to arbitrarily restrict the right of a person to travel or leave a country, and against all labor laws for identification documents to be confiscated. But international law has sadly not mattered much for the employers or the governments where these workers are employed. And on top of this, what perhaps is the most difficult problem to remedy are the recruiting fees that workers pay and that further trap them in bad jobs. Recruiting fees are supposed to be paid by employers, by businesses, and there are laws that are ostensibly designed to require them to do so. But in fact, what we've found everywhere we've investigated this issue is that workers are the ones who are paying between $2,000 and $4,000 in recruiting fees for the privilege of working in a receiving country, in a host country, and often devote 2 to 3 years of their entire wages, which are approximately for construction workers about $200 a month, to repay the loans, typically financed by the recruiting agents, and the mortgages of family land to do so. These conditions effectively entrap workers who are in fact not free to quit their jobs and find another one, and create tremendous incentives for employers to try to get away with as much as possible, knowing that workers have few options, even in the face of the worst abuse and exploitation. What we found in our investigations was the most common feature of abuse, of taking advantage of these trapped workers, is the non-payment of wages. Generally, for benign reasons such as easing cash flow burdens, reducing borrowing costs, and so forth. A bait and switch strategy where workers would agree to a particular job, perhaps indoors in a service capacity and a particular wage, only to find on their arrival that they had a different job, outdoor construction, and lower wages. Extremely long working hours with no rest periods, employment even during the hottest temperatures, over 100 degrees, despite laws that are supposed to ban work between certain hours of the day. Days off and vacations not granted, and housing would be in deplorable conditions with a dozen workers crammed into a room, poor sanitary and eating facilities, long distances from work sites, and even lacking air conditioning in the desert heat with little or no medical care. We also found a highly unregulated health and safety environment with minimal regular inspection or enforcement of labor codes, and shockingly high figures of construction worker deaths, including dozens of suicides. Many of the remedies, just a work site, available to workers in other countries and required by international law are unavailable. Workers can't go on strike because striking is against the law in virtually every country in the Gulf. And they can't form a union because forming a union is illegal. And they can't bargain collectively because bargaining collectively is illegal. And if they do, they are jailed and immediately deported. All of these are banned activities in the Arab Emirates and a number of the Gulf countries because they're considered first steps toward demanding other political rights. There's also an absence of real access to legal remedies with courts operating in Arabic, courts closed on typically the workers' only day off, and workers unable to reach them. What we've spent almost a decade pushing for is for governments to reform their own laws, to abolish the sponsorship system, to establish access to courts, to allow workers to form unions, and of course to enforce their own laws, which they've largely failed to do. But we also realized that there was a great deal of responsibility that lied with the businesses who are in fact the direct source of the abuse of migrant workers. And it was with that in mind that we realized that the private sector is in fact one of the most powerful levers we've had to push for reforms on the abuses of migrant workers. In the United Arab Emirates in particular, as a model, we've pressured cultural institutions, private businesses, and private public companies to address the abuses of workers involved in their projects with some very positive results. On Sadir Island, for example, which is the jewel crown of the United Arab Emirates, the government has started to develop a cultural island to host a branch of the Louvre Museum, New York University, the Guggenheim, and a number of other museums and cultural centers, each designed by world-renowned architects, including Zaha Hadid, Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, and so forth. When we realized we were making limited progress with the government, we decided to pursue the international actors who no doubt would be very sensitive to their reputational damage if their institutions were implicated in abuses. At first, they denied and obfuscated, insisting that the abuses we documented in Dubai, where we conducted our first investigation of construction worker abuses in the country, didn't exist in Abu Dhabi, where the island is located. So we investigated conditions on the island as well and found exactly the same conditions. The pressure we were able to generate on these institutions, on the development companies working with them, on the private-public company in the Emirates organizing everything, through advocacy and press conferences not only in Abu Dhabi, but in Paris and New York, where these institutions were based, Contacting their boards, their alumni, their supporters, was enough to force each of them to make public commitments, the first element of our demands and very important for holding private businesses, public institutions to their words, that they would respect worker rights, that they would ensure any worker involved on their work sites would be granted basic work conditions under international law, in accordance with businesses' human rights obligations. And the Ruggie principles were very important for us to be able to cite them as a source for noting their obligations. We also demanded that they reimburse workers found to have paid recruiting fees and ensure no passport confiscation. And they made promises on this front, public promises. We've also demanded that they rely on independent third-party monitors to verify labor conditions were being addressed. The government-owned Emirati partners were most resistant to this, refusing the notion of subjecting themselves to any kind of external review, but they eventually relented, appointing, interestingly, PricewaterhouseCoopers as independent monitors. This was a major breakthrough because it established the first precedent for independent monitoring of labor conditions in the Gulf, but also an interesting case study of how independent monitors can function. PricewaterhouseCoopers released its first public report on conditions there with highly embarrassing results just about a week and a half ago, basically verifying our findings on pervasive indebtedness for recruiting fees, ongoing passport confiscation, as well as poor housing conditions. All of the things that the hosts of these institutions, the Guggenheim, the Louvre, and New York University, had been assured wouldn't happen on their work sites. Now, of course, they are promising to redouble their efforts, having been exposed by their own independent monitors. In Qatar, the 2022 World Cup is now a very big focus of our advocacy. We've pursued all the private sector actors, the private sector contractors, the construction companies from around the world who are developing Qatar to host the World Cup Games into making the same public commitments that we obtained from the others. And Qatar's concern with its international standing gives us a great deal of leverage. I think the significance of targeting companies in the private sector is not only to curb the abuses that actually happen on their work sites, but to establish precedents for how things can and should be done in the region. And so it's very important to emphasize that we're not advocating that businesses stop doing business in the region, but that they do it the right way. I wanted to use this opportunity to highlight this work because I think there's a great deal of opportunity for many, many organizations to make a big difference in the lives of migrant workers, and really a lot of opportunity for reform and change. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah Lee Whitson. I think that was a remarkable and compelling analysis of migrant workers in the region, raising a whole range of human rights issues and also showing what can be done in addressing business and using the leverage of companies wanting to minimize their risk or wanting to avoid the downside of being associated with abuse of human rights. I think any of us who've been to the countries that you were describing know that this is the elephant in the room. Basically, this is the issue, and so it's great that you're working on it so well. I now want to introduce our second featured speaker, Mohammed Naji, whom I met for the first time this evening, but it's a great pleasure to introduce him because, having read a little of his background, I really admire your whole life. And I can't describe it all here because it would take too long. But basically, you've come from a poor family, from a lower middle income family in Cairo, and you decided as an enterprising child that you were going to further your education. You sold sandwiches to teachers and classmates to supplement your income, and you went on to university and graduated with your first degree, which is a degree in social work. And then you realized that you wanted also to study law, and you had to work hard in various ways and take various jobs to be able to study law. And you use your talent as a lawyer to serve your wider community. And you do it with a particular focus on an interest in environmental rights. So I'm particularly interested to hear how you describe your work. In 2001, Mohammed Naji founded the Habi Center for Environmental Rights, to move these ideas forwards, and he directs the centre with a staff now of 10. And so please come and tell us about your work, because it seems to me that it's been driven by a passion to serve others, and I like that very much. Please. Okay.